This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I am your host, Gilad Halpern.
And I'm your co-hostess, Dalia Shenlin. And we are making a special appeal. If you like us, please show it. We need your support. Please give to our show by going to our homepage, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll to the bottom and you'll see a big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us. We are counting on you. In return, every week we'll bring you episodes talking about books and research and other things that have caught our attention. Our guest today is Dr. Nurit Novis-Deutsch. She is a senior lecturer at the Department of Learning, Curriculum, and Instruction at the University of Haifa. She's a psychologist of religion, values, morality, and identity. Her research focuses on interaction between the personal and cultural domains in relation to religiosity, ultra-Orthodox Jews, young people, God concepts, Holocaust memory, and basically in any area where we might encounter this terrifying prospect of dual narratives, multiple identities, and psychological conflict, which for me is just about everywhere. We'll be discussing her numerous published academic articles. Nurit, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
You know, the very first line of one of your articles, I think, says a great deal. You ask, does the way we think about our personal self-complexity affect how we accept others? I think there's a whole universe inside that question. Tell us what you mean by that.
Okay. So, first of all, I think it is a pretty complex thing to unpack. And the two main concepts that we need to unpack for this one is identity or self-identity. And the other is obviously thinking about others. And I'll talk about a particular way of thinking about others, which is pluralism, okay? Acceptance of the very diversity, the very idea of difference. So let's just start for a minute with the self and identity. And you might want to think of your identity as clothing that you put on your internal self. It's the way you want to show others who you are, okay? The most important things for you to tell the world.
Now I understand why getting dressed is so hard in the morning.
And it gets worse because we don't just have one outfit. We have a closet full of outfits. And the big problem is they don't always fit together. And this is where it starts getting interesting. Because one of my theses is that the way we manage our own self-multiplicity or multiplicity of identities, the way we present ourselves, has a lot to do with how willing we are to accept diversity or difference in others. And maybe I'll just use a sentence that I really like that Cluckhone and Murray, two psychologists from the 50s in America, used. And they said that every person is in some ways like every other person, in other ways like some other people, and in other ways like no other person. Okay? So let's just think about that for a minute.
It's the theory of everything.
Yeah.
No, it's a cool sentence because the ways that we're like no other person are the ways that we're unique, okay? That's that part of our identity that is totally ours, that we feel makes us different from everybody and special. Okay. Then on the other side, there's the bit that we're like everybody else. That's our universal identity, the ways that we sort of feel like we embrace everybody and everything. In the middle, that's where the problem begins. Because in the middle are the bits of our identity that we call our social identity. And those are the ways that we're like some other people. And what does that mean? It means if we're like some other people, in other words, we belong to a group, our religion, a nationality, a professional identity, and so on and so forth, then we're also not like other people, the people who are outside that group.
Is that really the crux of what it is to be a social psychologist? I mean, the inherent tension between the social, what's outside of us, society, and the psychology, our individual self. Is the really clear-cut division between identity, what's inside us and what's outside us, and how they interact?
Yeah,
geology and geography, have a clear dividing line, and that's the earth.
Right, but no, in my opinion, not. Or let's put it this way. If you're a sociologist, then that might be a pretty good definition. But if you're a social psychologist, you're looking at everything through the perspective of the individual. Except you're taking into consideration the multitude of elements that affect our own psyche. And those are other people for the most part, right? So to come back to the question of identity in recalling that we're really talking about the individuals, okay? Different people have different ways of managing the fact that some of their identities are special to them and their groups and distinguish between them and other groups, we have I would say, an innate tendency. By now it's been pretty well shown that we have an innate tendency to prefer our own groups, our own group identities.
So we are sort of programmed for us then thinking.
Oh, absolutely. It's been shown in so many ways.
But aren't we also, this is my own pet theory,
Yeah.
not very scientifically proven other than just generally looking at the global history, don't we also love to break boundaries?
Yes, well, depends who. I think boundaries in general are a huge part of ourself, of our identity. There are just only two things that are important about who we are. It's what's inside, like who we are, and then that border that sets us apart from anything that isn't us. So when we break boundaries, we automatically build new ones. It's really like a cell kind of needs it to survive. A human needs it to survive as well. The bigger question then is, so maybe your question refers to how permeable the boundaries are. You know, how much
That's
we can
a good
sort
way
of
of restating.
change them. But the bigger question is, what do we do about those that are on the outside of our boundaries, of our group boundaries?
Oh, well, some people just kill them.
Yeah. Or hate them, or look down on them, or tolerate them, which is not much better, because tolerance comes with the idea that you're wrong, but for various reasons, I'm going to just bear it and, I'm going to be okay with it, sort of.
So where does pluralism fit into this? Is pluralism a form of I can tolerate all these different ideas even if they're wrong? Or is pluralism a way of saying multiple others may be right and I'm also right and that's okay?
And is it a useful case in point because it really sits on these fault lines that you just described?
What fault lines?
No,
Sorry.
the interaction where pluralism comes between our identity and our assumed identity.
So I think pluralism is a key concept that replaces the whole set of tolerance and willingness to accept others. Pluralism is different. It has to do with accepting diversity, accepting difference and believing that it has a role. And even more than that, if you want to go to what's called strong pluralistic opinions, it's believing that this is the way the world is, that it describes something real about the essence of human reality and perhaps of existence, that there is no one thing, that you can't limit everything to one central idea. There is just a multiplicity of concepts, of ideas, of values, and of course, of ways of being, of lifestyles, but those come later.
Now, is there a normative element here? Are you essentially claiming that that's a better way to be?
So that's a very difficult question. Because
What can I do? I have to ask.
No. That's okay. First of all, personally, I do believe that pluralism is the way to go. But when I research it, I do my very, very best to set that aside because what I'm looking at, I'm not a philosopher. I love philosophy, but I'm not a philosopher. A philosopher would have something to say about that. He or she would say pluralism is a better way of thinking of the world, let's say ontologically or perhaps epistemologically, because A, B, C, D. I'm looking at something else. I'm looking at people. And I'm asking myself, what makes one person veer more or feel a pull more towards multiplicity and another person to just feel really drawn towards unity, a single concept, making everything fit together, harmony.
Or what William James called the monist thinking?
Right, that would be monism. And on the other hand, we have pluralism, and that's the essence of what I'm talking about. I specifically research something that Isaiah Berlin, the philosopher, called value pluralism. And he actually did talk about people who differ in this a little, but he was sort of like a couch psychologist. He didn't actually research this.
I've never heard Berlin be called a couch anything, but
I know it's not fair.
Innovative.
But just in that sense, in that one sense, I think he was brilliant. But he didn't do psychological research. He did other amazing things. And what he said is that you can look at people and see that some of them are, he used two animal metaphors. He talked about hedgehogs and foxes. And he was basing it on a very ancient saying of a philosopher, a Greek philosopher called Archilochus, who said, the fox knows many tricks, but the hedgehog knows only one, right? Those are his...
but very
words.
deeply.
Not so much very deeply, but he can use it for everything. He uses one principle for everything. The fox uses multiple principles, as it were. And people indeed can be considered more foxish or more hedgehogish. What I'm doing is I'm trying to measure that.
And what accounts for this propensity? Is it really innate personality traits or is it really a situational thing?
Well, that's exactly what I'm trying to look at. First of all, I don't think anything is either innate or external, is either situational or dispositional. It's always both. And a really good place to see it is when you look at what I call both and reasoning. That is I ended up with that concept for the cognitive aspect of thinking pluralistically. Both/and is sort of the opposite of either or thinking, right? And it does have a lot to do with personality. For example, in personality psychology, we have an important theory which talks about the big 5 aspects of personality, and one of them is openness to experience. As you can imagine, and this has been, in my research, has also shown itself, the more people are open to experience, the more they tend to be willing to think in what we call both and reasoning. Okay, they're willing to think that there's more than one way of doing things, or more than one value that is irreducibly or incommensurably important. But then, it's not only about personality. There are some societies where children are socialized and schooled very early on to believe in one overarching ideal. It doesn't have to be, we might think automatically of some religious or fundamentalist places. It can also be other ideologies.
Like what? Because a lot of your research is on religious communities. So what are some of the other examples of communities like that?
Right. So first of all, I'll say up front that I haven't studied these others. I indeed am interested in the interface between religiosity and pluralism. But one might think that ideologies such as communism or other totalitarian ideologies, anything that ends up with one way of living, one truth, right, could fit this mold.
What about democracy and pluralism? Does that fit the mold?
Democracy as being
a big sort of principle. I mean, because when you look at pluralism, this is what I've been thinking when I read your stuff, that it is to a great extent something that we are being inculcated into believing in. I mean, going back to the normative aspect of it, but not necessarily. I mean, this is something that we imbibe from a very, very early stage as something to aspire to.
Right. So what I think is that different, let's call them for now ideologies, okay? Anything that ends with an ism you could conceivably describe as an ideology, including humanism, for example. All of these include values in them. The question is, what place do they make for second-order values? A value about values. And this value, in the case of pluralism, this value is that there are multiple legitimate and important and good values. So maybe I'll just read you a little quotation from Isaiah Berlin that I'm very fond of.
I'm always happy to hear Isaiah Berlin quotations.
So this is how he describes value pluralism. He says, value pluralism is the conception that there are many different ends that people may seek and still be fully rational, capable of understanding each other and sympathizing and deriving delight from each other. So you can feel here that there's also an emotional component to it. There's also a philosophical component to it. And it doesn't necessarily, the basic idea is that it doesn't fit with any one ideology, but some ideologies have more space for this kind of conception of humanity, and others have less.
But now I have to ask, isn't there a danger that this slides into cultural relativism? Where is the line that you try to draw in your work between this kind of pluralistic thinking and relativism?
Right. So first of all, I just have to say I'm not scared of cultural relativism.
Okay.
I think it's a very, very interesting and important concept to explore.
Good.
However, for this matter, again, as a psychologist, most people shy away from relativism. They don't like it, and it's not the way they think about the world. So whether or not I like it or not philosophically, again, is a separate question. In terms of how people think, the important difference between, a couple of differences between pluralism and relativism. The first is a very obvious one. A pluralist believes there is more than one good way to live a worthy life, or all of these other alternatives, but not that every form of life or every ideology is a worthy one. Okay? The second thing has to do with commitment. A relativist, ultimately, because there is no way of measuring anything, right? Everything is completely relative. There's no measurement stick, as it were, measuring yard. So a relativist often doesn't see how he or she himself can commit to any specific idea. And often there's a sort of a fluidity about it also in practice.
Is that what's so scary about it? people don't know where to commit themselves.
It can be, and that might be what is scary for some people. Studies show that most people don't like that. There are some who thrive on this fluidity, but most people like to know who they are, where they are. Again, it comes back to boundaries. Pluralism, in my opinion, doesn't preclude commitment. In fact, it requires commitment because in order to be a pluralist, you have to have a whole bunch of ideas or communities that uphold these ideas. So you can choose, so you can experience all of them and, choose or just enjoy them all. Isaiah Berlin mentioned derive delight from them. If we don't have people committed to these different ideas, we're either going to be parasites living on other people's commitment, or there's going to be nothing to be pluralistic about. So a pluralist, in effect, has to also embrace personal commitment.
I wanted to ask you perhaps a lexical question of definition about the use of the word pluralism. Isaiah Berlin, the paragon of liberalism, has come up a few times in this conversation. And I'd like to ask you whether pluralism is just as like a subcategory of liberalism, or how do you place it vis-a-vis liberalism? And also you write in your work that pluralism is not the opposite of prejudice, and it's not synonymous with tolerance. So can you explore really the lexical field in which you work?
Yeah. All right, let me say this. The question of how people deal with multiplicity, multiple everything, ways of life, values, etc., it's as ancient as humans are, if you ask me. Sure, in the very old times, in the ancient times, people could live their whole life not knowing too many different ways of life, but everybody was a little bit exposed to otherness. It was impossible not to. And so to say that pluralism as a philosophy is a modern philosophy is true, but that's just for the concept of pluralism, the philosophical idea, for example, of Berlin's value pluralism, and there are multiple other philosophical worlds of pluralism. But there are plenty of other ways, for example, non-Western ways, Eastern, I don't even know if to call them philosophies or just ways of life, that talk about Confucius, right? Talk about how you should accept diversity. Okay. So just to make that clear, this issue is much, much larger than only a specific branch of philosophy in modern age. Now, you asked about how pluralism and prejudice interact. And one of the comments I sometimes receive is, well, prejudice has been studied to death. And why is pluralism not just the opposite of prejudice? And the more you look into it, you realize that they're not opposites at all. Of course, they're related in the sense that the more pluralistic you are, the less you tend to be prejudiced towards others. But at the basis, they're different. I'll try to explain why. Both of them are functional concepts. In other words, they relate to how to manage in society. Okay, they have a function. But prejudice typically is a way of managing other groups, others, and specifically of strengthening one's in-group. So it's one might say not a very successful mechanism, but it comes from that world of in-group, out-group, preference for in-group, all the way back to preference for kin, right? Evolutionary sort of biology, psychology. Pluralism comes from a different place. It comes from the fact, first of all, pluralism began when cultures began. Okay, prejudice might have began earlier.
No, I'm just curious because it sounds like what you're saying is pluralism is not only about the outgroup, but so much about how we think of ourselves and the ability to see that our ideas may be right, but also may be wrong. I mean, isn't that an individual characteristic that you then argue carries over into the external sphere?
I think it comes from both places. I think it has to do with complexity. And the more we realize that we ourselves as individuals are complex, the more we have the possibility of being more pluralistic, but also in society, also looking outwards. When cultures grew and multiplied, we needed some way of managing that. And the basic paradigm of, let's call it, evolutionary preference for in-groups is not going to take us very far with trying to manage multiple cultures. For that, we need some sort of way of thinking that involves tolerance for contradiction, for multiplicity of ideas, okay? Not of other groups. So whilst prejudice deals with other groups, Pluralism deals with multiple ideas.
Well, I think this is the fascinating thing because there's two elements that I want to pick up on in your work. One is a deep exploration of this idea, and I don't know if it's just your idea, that a person who confronts multiplicities of identities within themselves, within one person, is more likely to also have more pluralistic thinking towards society and other groups. Can you talk about your research on that?
Yeah, I've done a few studies on that. I've looked at some groups that I thought might feel particularly challenged by this concept of pluralism. So I looked, for example, at religious psychoanalysts. Now, religious psychoanalysts are characterized by two things, prima facie, like before we even start looking at what they actually do. One is, we might assume that they are socialized with a double dose of monism because, and I'm talking here about Orthodox religious. So the one thing about these religious psychoanalysts, and the Jewish psychoanalysts, is that Judaism is a pretty monistic religion. I mean, by definition, it's monotheistic. It has one ideal, the ideal of a single God, of unity, right? It's very, very basic too. And there's one true way and one Torah, et cetera, et cetera.
And as you point out, these communities do not nurture the value of pluralism, which I don't know if it's unique to Judaism, but you make a statement like it's not the highest value for them.
Well, I'll bracket that.
Okay.
Because I think there are definitely ways, and there have been very, very important ways in which Judaism has endorsed pluralism. But to start with, it is a monistic ideology. And so is psychoanalysis. Okay? Freud was a scientist. He believed he was discovering the truth about the human psyche. There weren't two ways about it.
Yes, but a lot has been written about the Freudian jihad.
And the fact that even Freud might have been wrong. I mean, so much of this is simply accepting that, the humility of saying, I have my theory, or as the great man Leonard Cohen once said, there's a mighty judgment coming, but I might be wrong. I mean, isn't so much of this about accepting that any one of our ideologies may be right, but it also may be wrong?
There are two levels to pluralism. What you're describing now is what you might call soft pluralism. There might be a truth out there, or even there is a truth out there, but how do I know what it is? I'm small, I'm human, I'm fallible, etc. There's also a strong pluralism, which argues that basically, deep down, there is no one single truth. There is multiplicity, there is complexity. That's what it is. Reality is complex, it's irreducible to any single principle, and all of our values are incommensurable. You can't trade them one for each other. Each of them are
Where do religious Jews come into that?
Religious psychoanalysts, as I said, are characterized by two things, not by one. One is that they probably were enculturated with a double dose of monism. The second is that these two philosophies that they personally endorse actually contradict each other pretty strongly. So it's not impossible to sort of harmonize them. But basically, anybody who's read Freud knows that he was an outspoken atheist who wrote at least 4 important books: Civilization and Its Discontent, The Future of an Illusion, Totem and Taboo, Moses and Monotheism. All of these books arguing that there is no way that religion is anything but an illusion, but a wish that people really have. Okay, so how are you both a psychoanalyst, and is it harming something in your commitment? Is your commitment sort of not very strong? Or what happens there? That's what I was looking at. And what I discovered in that particular study is that although there were a few ways of managing these multiple identities, by far the most dominant way was the psychoanalyst saying the following: I'm living with a contradiction. It is uncomfortable for me. I acknowledge that. I'm not minimizing it. It doesn't feel good to me, okay? This is not a sort of a postmodern fluidity. But I hold on to that complexity. I just grab onto it and I don't let go. I refuse to try to simplify it because it isn't simple. And that is how they live their life in a very complex and interesting way.
But is your argument that they are then more pluralist-oriented in their social lives?
Okay, and that was the next thing. I wanted to look at their attitudes towards others and otherness. And these people live in Orthodox societies where, for example, such ways of life as homosexuality are frowned upon, and multiple other othernesses. And what I heard from them time and time again was, in this one way, we're not very Orthodox. And we're also not very Orthodox psychoanalytically. We really don't have any urge or need to convert others to our way of thought. We really believe that there are many good and worthy ways of living.
So what psychological role or function does religiosity fill for them? Because if it's not, one truth, one God, and all these things that, I would assume people turn to religion for in the first place, why are they religious?
Well, you might assume that, but if I may say so, you may be wrong.
I probably am.
No, I don't know. But okay, take that out of the...
No.
We love to be critiqued and be wrong. I mean,
Sorry.
we don't love it, but we love it.
Let me tell you about a study that I just took part in. Its center was in Finland, an Åbo Academy study, and I was one of the researchers. We interviewed and surveyed 5,000 young adults about their religiosity throughout the world in 13 different locations. One of them was Israel. I've been analyzing the data now for about a year. And what we see is that one of the main ways of being religious and one of the main functions that religiosity fills for these young adults, 18 to 30-year-olds, is that it gives them a way of seeking and asking questions. It's not a certainty. It's not an answer. It's certainly not a single truth. That is something that very, very few people, and our sample included people from Ghana and Turkey and the Druze in Israel and various other traditional societies. So Peru and, I'm not talking only about Finland and Scandinavia. For many, many young adults, religion is more of a way of life, of searching for meaning and gradually finding it, but not in certain terms.
So would you say, it's questions rather than answers, would you say that young people who, major in philosophy or travel to India to get in touch with the spiritual self, it is the same kind of psychological mechanism that's at work there?
Yes, I think trying to find meaning, or what I call in some of my other research, meaning making, is a huge part of what we're trying to do as well, in my opinion, as humans, but certainly as young adults.
Let me just ask you about, I could not help but think, especially while reading the article where I think you sort of make this connection between internal identity contradictions and external pluralist thinking. Can we take away a prescriptive element from this in a political environment where people are so angry at each other and so dismissive of other arguments? Couldn't we just say this is the future? Teach young people from a very early age to embrace their multiple identities, to not run away from their contradictions, and they will be better citizens in the future.
So I don't think you could have said better what I'm trying to do now in my educational research, which is exactly develop programs, which we're now starting to run as interventions in schools, to see how you can help people enhance their both and reasoning. And I think you're absolutely right. The more freedom there is, the more fluidity and the more options there are, the more plurality there is, the more people sometimes, or societies, will react by closing off, by folding in, by looking for the clear borders. And we see so much of that today. We see from the election of Donald Trump to the alt-right movements all over Europe, to increased anti-Semitism everywhere in Europe, anti-immigration, right? This is, in some way, we feel it. This is a reaction. And part of this reaction is, in my opinion, to a reality of plurality without the ensuing educational basis for how to live with it.
Ensuing or necessary condition?
Yeah, necessary. In my opinion, necessary. And since we don't have it, what we end up with is a lot of confusion. And so I think education is definitely the key. And that's what I'm putting my efforts into these days.
I feel like we have so many implications of this that we could really talk about in the current political environment that we live in, in Israel and America, which we've just opened up. But boy, that would be a whole separate episode.
Yeah. All right, Dr. Nurit Novis-Deutsch, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And many thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, to Itai Shalom, our producer, and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. Please consider writing us a review on the Apple Podcasts app. And consider supporting us on our website, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing on to our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive with almost, perhaps even more than 500 interviews already. And if you like us here, please like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast Ideas from Israel. And follow me and Dalia on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from Dalia and from me, goodbye.